My name is Heike Weimans. I'm currently president of the Society for Ethnobotany. And I am really very pleased how these student cafes are developing and that we have quite a bit of interest. And I think this kind of a little bit more informal events are missing in part in our academic life, and particularly in our contacts with students. Of course, in classes, we are sometimes a little bit more informal and we talk about general life experiences, but generally, students have little opportunity to interact with each other and also with professors from other continents, no? So it's great, Doug and Lupita, and I hope we can continue to organize these events because I think they are very helpful and interesting. The ones we had up to now were great. So thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Litt, for helping us out here. And so go ahead.
Guadalupe, were you going to introduce me or should I just jump in?
I think Lupita is going to introduce you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Douglas, did you want to say anything before I introduce Amy?
Just to welcome members and inform them that we have these episodes monthly. There is another one coming next month. And also thank Litt and our president for attending and spending their time. And also informing all members that this is being recorded and we'll upload it in our website. Thank you, all the best. Back to you, Lupe.
Okay, thank you, Douglas. Yeah, I just wanted to introduce Amy, Dr. Amy Litt. So I was actually a student in her course where she included these topics of decolonization in botany. And so I invited her here, although I understand this is not her specialization. You know, she researches plant evolution, specifically Manzanitas. But, you know, her course really had a big effect on me. And this was at a graduate level. Before my time in her course, I had never given this information or been taught botany in this lens of decolonization. And I was sharing to Amy that this changed the perspective that I viewed botany, because before I did not see myself as a part of botany. You know, I saw early explorers that you know, didn't look like me. I did not relate to until her course. I started to learn, you know, this knowledge and advancements in botany, for the most part, was built on the labor of, you know, people of color and indigenous people. And so that really revolutionized how I viewed botany, not just as a spectator, but it was something that belonged to me too. And so I wanted to share that little experience of mine, just to explain why I invited Amy to give this talk. So yeah, thank you, Amy, so much. And I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, so thank you very much for inviting me. I've never spoken on this topic to anybody. And as I was explaining, you know, and as Guadalupe had said, you know, I am not an expert on this. It's not something I've done research on, but through some experiences that I'll sort of explain to you, I you know, sort of began to see that there's a problem there, that there are a lot of things that are just not part of the sort of way that we think when we're teaching botany, when we're talking about botany and things like that. And so I, you know, began to think, you know, well, I would like to start actually talking about some of these things in the classes that I teach. And I was both kind of shocked and disappointed when Guadalupe told me that I was like the only faculty member, the only class that she took that actually did touch on these things. So, you know, that to me is disturbing, because it's not difficult to start incorporating sort of decolonization narratives into teaching. So, you know, because I'm not an expert in this and I'm not steeped in theory or anything, basically what my plan for today is to, first of all, explain to you a little bit kind of the journey that I took to get where I am now. Partly because I think it, and this is sort of like emblematic of the whole thing, like where I am and what I'm doing and what I learned and how I learned it is all part and parcel of this whole concept of, you know, of how we think about botany, right? So everybody views it through their own lens. And my lens was very, very narrow, and I've been trying to sort of expand it. And so I feel like my personal journey here might be helpful for other people to know. And then I'll sort of talk about two different areas in which I've been trying to address these issues. So I will share my screen and get going here. This is going to take me a second. And I do, you know, I'm not a tech pro or anything, and I do, and so I'm going to fumble a little bit, but also I want this to be sort of, you know, very informal. And if anybody at any point has a question, please just offer it up, you know, unmute yourself or put something in the chat, which I probably won't see, but hopefully a moderator will see it and be able to then pose the question. Okay. Do you see my screen? Somebody?
Yes.
Okay, all right, great, thank you.
Yes,
So
yes.
this is what I chose as a title. I'm not very comfortable with sort of labels and terms that I think have a lot of power. And so I'm a little uncomfortable with the term decolonizing. I don't feel like I can lay claim to that. I've just taken a few steps towards addressing what I think of as dishonest ways in which we've been presenting science and the exclusionary ways that we've been teaching. So that's why I chose this title. And it is just my first steps. This is an ongoing thing. So, okay, let's see if I can get this to advance. Okay. So, like I said, a little bit about my background. I grew up in a white middle-class family. I had two college-educated professional working parents. We had enough money. We had a lot of family support. We had leisure time, things like that. And you can see here, this is me over here. Can you see my pointer? Well, anyway, whether you can or not, I'm the one on the right. The little girl apparently interested in my grandfather's stomach there. So that just shows you a little bit about my family. And then I lived in an integrated suburb of New York City. My parents actually chose it because it was integrated, but very typical of that era, it was sort of de facto segregated, because by the time we got to high school, the Black students and white students were in different classes. And so we really didn't have an opportunity to learn about each other's experiences. My parents were liberal progressives for that era, but one of the things that I've really become acutely aware of is that what was considered liberal and progressive in the 60s and 70s, the hippie era when I grew up, has since then been shown to actually still carry a lot of racism and bias, et cetera. So, anyway, so that's sort of like a little bit of context. I went to a private college, and I taught then after that, I taught at a private middle school and high school for smart, rich kids. This is by way of telling you that my experience in the educational world was basically with, privileged white people. And the picture in the lower right is I'm the one with the right here in the middle. That's a picture of me in a theater production when I was in college. So you can just see the life I was leading. So I've lived a life of privilege. And also, I think it's important to recognize that I am, in fact, a boomer. And so the era that I grew up in, as I was just saying, was very different, and attitudes were different, and understandings were different. And a lot of people who grew up in that era, I think kind of infamously, a lot of people who grow up in that era haven't kind of realized that things have gone beyond that the understandings that we had then, the language that we used then, we progressed beyond that. And what was, considered sort of, an acceptable way to view things back in the 60s and 70s, we now understand actually still is actually really, racist and discriminatory. Okay. On top of that, like most people, I sort of never questioned standard teaching approaches, standard pedagogical ideas and priorities. Like, this is what you teach and this is how you teach it. And I never really thought about how the impact of a kind of a one-size-fits-all model, the impact of that on the students. And in the same way, I never questioned the sort of, as I said, rightness and truth of Western scientific thought. It's objective, it's reality, that's the right way to look at things. And I never really sort of thought about that. And it coupled in with all of that is I never thought about the historical development of the ideas and the historical practices that led to the development of these pedagogical and scientific approaches and knowledge. So, okay, so how did I sort of get started? How did I kind of get past that? Because, for most of my life, I just never gave any of this any thought. So the first thing that happened was I moved from the East Coast to UCR. And UC Riverside, where I am now in Guadalupe is a very, very different type of school, and the student body is very different. The college I went to was largely white. It was a boarding school. Most of the people came from privileged families. UCR, a lot of the students live at home. We're 60% first-generation college students. A lot of students grow up in Spanish-speaking homes, things like that. So all of a sudden, I had to realize that the way that I had sort of been taught to teach was not reaching these students. Then after I'd been here for a few years, the pandemic hit. And like many people during the pandemic, especially the first year, I taught this class that I'll spend most of my time talking about. I taught that class immediately after the lockdown, immediately after it. And it was really apparent to me and many other people, how do I want to say this? Like, all of a sudden, it's like, plant diversity, who cares? We want to keep people alive, right? We want to keep people sane and functional. And so, all of a sudden I started to sort of question my priorities. And it's not as if I'm not going to teach plant diversity and I'm not going to expect students to learn something about it. But all of a sudden, the way I was presenting it and my expectations and my requirements and my evaluations, all of a sudden I thought, this is not appropriate for this period of time. And it really fundamentally actually changed the way I thought about teaching. And the final thing was I served on this committee, a campus-wide committee at UC Riverside that was tasked with evaluating the general education curriculum. It did not have a good outcome in that we came up with what we thought was a brilliant plan, and everybody was like, no way, I'm not making any changes. So that was disappointing. But the thing about it for me was that it was, like I said, a campus-wide committee, and it was the first time I'd served on a committee with a lot of people who were in the humanities, social sciences, psychology, the arts, etc. And listening to them talk had a profound effect on me. The kinds of things that I've started thinking about, that's what they do. That's who they are. And so listening to them talk was just really like mind-opening for me. And one thing, for instance, was I learned the term epistemology, which many of you may be familiar with. But at the time, those of us in the sciences who were on this committee, we were meeting on Zoom because, again, it was a pandemic. So, of course, we're having all kinds of side conversations in the chat. And we're like, what the heck does that mean? Like, none of us, even if we'd heard of it, we had no idea what it meant. So, of course, we all went and Googled it, and it said ways of knowing. And we're like, well, that's helpful. What does that mean? But when I started to think about it, I thought, yeah, this is a really important concept. Like, I grew up in a white privileged way of knowing things, which was considered the norm. That was the standard. That was what everyone should aspire to, right? But there are many, many different ways of viewing the world, many different ways of learning things. Even the fact that people speak different languages, the words and the ways of expressing things express different ways of understanding the universe. And so, for instance, one, really obvious example to my mind is, if somebody is a person of faith who believes that God created the world around us, they look around themselves and they see, the wonder of God's works, right? The miracle of God. When somebody like me, who is, essentially an atheist non-believer, looks around the world, what I see is, isn't physics amazing? Isn't chemistry amazing? Isn't biology amazing? So these are just totally different ways of viewing the diversity of life, for instance, around us. So this actually was really, really seminal in my sort of beginning to understand that for instance, the students in my class are all coming from different places. And anyway, I'll get into that a little bit more, but I'm starting to babble. So, okay, so all of these prompted me to start thinking about my teaching methods and priorities. So I kind of developed two goals. One of them was to create a classroom where these different experiences, different ways of knowing, different students are valued, and where students can contribute in different ways. They have different ways to show their knowledge, to excel, and hopefully everyone can feel welcome and valued. This is an ongoing thing. I've made some strides, but there's a long way to go. And, I have to accept also that probably there are always going to be students who don't take to my particular teaching method. And then the other thing was to introduce different perspectives into my teaching, and recognize the, colonial influences in science. Okay, so I'm going to go through these two things, the first one and then two. Okay, so for number one, for both of these, how did I have to approach this? So examine my own privileges, examine my own perspectives, and importantly, as part of this, identify my own biases and how those biases are then reflected in my teaching and thinking. This is like, number one, that we all have to do this. And related to that, to think carefully about the language that I use, because again, growing up, there were all kinds of things that we would say as jokes that looking back on them now, I'm kind of horrified and thinking, wow, that was actually really pretty racist. But at the time, it was like, oh, it's just a joke, So thinking about the language and what that language conveys is like super important. And I'll give you a couple examples. Again, questioning what I know about good teaching, questioning the position of scientific systems and concepts as the right way to look at things. And then, trying to then identify the ways in which science and pedagogy incorporate bias and prejudice. And as I said, this is not my research area, so I've just been approaching it by reading things, listening to people, going to talks, listening to these people who are in the humanities who are so well informed about this, asking questions, etc. Okay, so with regard to the first thing about sort of creating an inclusive classroom, this is a picture of Dr. Tara Yasso, who's in the UC Riverside School of Education. It so happens that she was on this General Education Review Committee, and she introduced me to an idea that I guess is pretty well known actually in the humanities called cultural capital. And the idea is that, well, here, I'll put this up here. This is a lot of writing, but it says, I'll summarize it. The concept of community cultural wealth or cultural capital posits that marginalized groups possess capital, that is to say, skills, knowledge, understanding that goes unrecognized and acknowledged. it critiques the idea that white upper middle class capital is desirable and marginalized groups are in deficit in relation to privileged white groups. That is to say, they don't have that capital, and that puts them in a sort of a position of being in a deficit. And so Yosso's argument is that these marginalized groups have different forms of capital that are also valued. And so this is sort of my simplified take home. All students have cultural capital, and that is the skills, the knowledge, the understandings that come from their experience, their lived experience, their culture, their family, where they grew up, things like that. But only some forms of cultural capital are valued in our educational system. And generally, that is the capital that is more or only accessible to students from privileged backgrounds. So the example that she gave, which I'm not sure is quite as strong now, is that keyboarding and coding skills are valued, but those are going to be more available to students who have time, leisure time on their hands, who have access to computers at home, things like that. Whereas other students may have the ability to fluently translate complex medical information to their parents and then translate their parents' response back to the doctor, and that's not valued. Another example, I think, is that is related to that is that students in families of privilege, they have ample time to study, to do extra credit. This is why I never give extra credit assignments, because only people who have time on their hands can do an extra credit assignment. Many of our students, they have jobs, they take care of younger siblings or older relatives, and the skills that they learn doing that, organizational skills, interpersonal interactions, things like that, those are not valued. So an inclusive classroom has to promote and value all these diverse forms of cultural capital. And this is actually what I find really difficult. So some of the things I've thought about that are sort of related to that, but not exactly the same, is the fact that not everyone is good at test taking. This may be because of their background, or it may just be who they are, or answering certain kinds of questions. So if we limit our assessments to one type of assessment, like if you only give exams, right, that's going to disadvantage students who may not do well on exams. They may struggle to demonstrate their knowledge in that format. And that's what we want. We want to assess them based on their knowledge, right? So likewise, not everyone is good at memorization. Also, I personally think memorization is a waste of time because we have the internet, right? You can look anything up. So things like understanding, synthesis, application, these should be more important. Why are we stressing memorization? Of course, you know, botany is just absolutely full of vocabulary. And why do we make students memorize what all of these different terms mean? So this is just in case you are not familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, which has been really, really influential in pedagogy. So Bloom's taxonomy is sort of showing that there are these different sort of levels of, how do I want to say, different levels of knowledge or understanding or ability to sort of process information, starting with just, as it says at the bottom, recognizing and recalling facts, memorizing, right? And then going all the way up to taking that information and creating something new with it. And there's a series of terms that are associated with each of these levels, but I didn't include those up here because they're kind of not really that, you know, you can look at them and say, well, I don't agree that this one should go in this category. So I didn't put those up there, but it's really useful, I think, a useful framework to think, you know, is my class entirely based on remember? You know, is it based entirely on remember? In which case it's like, well, then I'm only giving, you know, good evaluations to students who are good at remembering. I'm not able to adequately evaluate students who are better at analysis or better at creating. Okay. So how have I tried to incorporate this? And I'm mainly going to be talking about this plant diversity and evolution class because the other class that I teach, this class is smaller, so I have a lot more flexibility to do a lot of diverse types of assignments. My other class not only is larger, it also is a prerequisite for other courses, and it's taught every quarter. And so I'm a little bit more kind of constrained in what I present and how I present it, so that it's considered kind of the same from quarter to quarter. But most importantly, I've only taught that class for 2 years, and so I haven't made as many changes, whereas this plant diversity and evolution class I've taught for like 7 years or something now, and it's not a prerequisite for anything, so I can do whatever I want. Okay, so the first thing I've tried to do is create a diversity of assessments. I got rid of the exams entirely, and I give weekly quizzes. And to further sort of reduce memorization, in recent years, I've started giving the students a note card that they can, take notes on as they're studying, and then bring that into the quiz. I don't feel that they all really make that good use of it, but I will say one thing is that it reduces anxiety tremendously. And those quizzes have a mixture of short answer and free response and diagrams and things like that. I also assign them a short research paper, like 2 pages, and an oral presentation based on that. The paper has 3 sections that are due now sequentially. That's something I've implemented in recent years. They're due sequentially, so they don't have like a big thing due all at the end of the quarter. We have a peer review process, which we've had to grade, because otherwise the students would just, read it, and at the top they would write, what does that say? Hold on a second. Oh, okay, thank you. They would, when we did the peer review and we didn't grade it, the students who were doing the reviewing would just read it and write a comment at the top saying, oh, I really enjoyed reading this. And it was not informative or helpful. So we actually started grading the peer review itself, although we grade very lightly. We always give them an option to hand things early for feedback, with no penalty for any issues that are on the early draft. And also, recently, I've been thinking about the fact that people, grow up in households that speak different languages, and recognizing that, some of the students, their vocabulary just is not as expansive as some of the other students. And so I've stopped penalizing errors in grammar, vocabulary, punctuation, unless they just, if they get a review and there are these problems and they don't look into them and try to change them, then we may dock them a little bit. So another assignment, then I give them a variety of diverse assignments during the course of the quarter. One of them is this morphology scavenger hunt, which I have to say most of the students really enjoy. Can somebody else monitor the chat? And if there's a question, can you read it out? Because otherwise I have to stop what I'm saying to look at the chat. So.
No, there's no questions. I've been looking.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thanks. Okay, so this morphology scavenger hunt, I give them a list of 30 different types of plant traits, like entire leaf margin, fused petals, things like that. And then we give them a couple of weeks, and they have to go out and find examples of those and take a picture and submit it. And you see the little praying mantis there. I give them each 2 little plastic animals that they have to include in the picture, so that I can confirm that they took the picture and didn't get it off of Google or something. So, and most of the students actually really enjoy that, and it just gets them out and around looking at the plants. It started again during the pandemic, when we couldn't have field trips or anything, and it was something that everybody could do no matter where they lived. I also give them a few blog reading assignments. I'll talk about another one in a minute, but this one is just a sort of a fun thing. Based on there's a blog called Botanist in the Kitchen that, again, talks about plants in cooking. And one of the ones that we've had them read is called we call it the basil angiosperm cake, but the title is actually Origin Stories, Spices from the Lowest Branches of the Tree. And you can see below the quote, this is their description. Why do so many rich tropical spices come from a few basal branches of the plant evolutionary tree? Catherine looks to their ancestral roots and finds a cake recipe. And we just give them a series of sort of questions to answer about it that have to do with the species that are named in the blog. And then everybody has to do a herbarium plant collection. We're still working on trying to make this effective. But again, this is something where they get the assignment that pretty near the beginning of the quarter. We've started to structure it again so that part of it is due halfway through the term and part of it at the end, so they don't all put it off till the last minute. But again, this is something that they do on their own time, and they can do it, you know, in groups or independently. We've started grading lab notebooks, but I have to say we're not doing a very good job at this. We give everybody a good grade, really, because they all actually do a good job. But it takes time, and we haven't really fully incorporated this into the class yet. But at any rate, the point is we have a diversity of assessments. So if students are not that good on the quizzes, they have lots of other ways they can get a good grade. I'm also trying to give students an opportunity to pursue their interests. A lot of them take the course because they need another lab course to fulfill their requirements. But a lot of them take them because they grew up in a household where maybe their father had a garden in the back where he grew some plants, some food plants from his home country, or you know, things like that. And so, you know, I want to be able to try to sort of take advantage of that. I haven't really gotten this one worked out yet. For the paper and presentation, I give them a list of plant families that they can choose from, because a lot of them just like to be told sort of what to do. But they can also suggest a topic of their own. And some of them do have things that they're really passionate about. And so then they can do the paper on that. And the content of part of the paper is structured. Like the first part is supposed to be sort of the phylogenetic context of whatever plants they're talking about. And the second is, you know, the characteristics of the plant, what the leaves look like, et cetera. But the last one is like whatever you think is interesting about this family. And that's where, of course, you know, things get interesting. We've had students writing about, you know, the nightshade family, witchcraft in the nightshade family, and the domestication of rice, and all kinds of different sorts of topics. That doesn't work. Okay. The presentations themselves can be in any format. Almost everyone does a PowerPoint, you know, that's the low-hanging fruit. But we've had cooking demonstrations, a number of different types of videos, et cetera. So I was sort of hoping people would take more advantage of that, but I also understand at the end of the term, people just kind of want to get it over with. And then the lab is unstructured. So the class is set up 3 hours twice a week. The first half is lecture, the second half is lab. And for the lab, we just bring in a lot of plant material and of the whatever, you know, we've been talking about that day. And then they have an opportunity to look at it. So again, a lot of students sort of like things to be very structured. So we give them a list of questions like, are the petals fused or separate? You know, how many stamens are there? Things like that. But they also are just free to look at them and poke around. And there are always a number of students who will grab a bunch of stuff, grab a microscope, and spend the whole time just like poking around. And half the time, you know, they'll call me over and say, you know, what is this? And I'll be looking at like something I've never seen before. And I was like, that's a good find. I have no idea. Let's, you know, try to figure that out. So, and also it's a sort of the lab is informal, pretty casual. So it's a good time to sort of get to know them, talk to them, get to know their background, get to know what's going on in their life that maybe, you know, if there's a student who's not doing well, it's a good time to sort of maybe just pull them aside for a few minutes and say, you know, how can we help you, you know, do better in this class and enjoy yourself more. So. Okay, and then a lot of the assignments are flexible. As I said, you know, some of them, the students have a lot of options, and also we will accept almost all of them early for feedback. So yeah. Okay, another thing is that we try to provide materials. So in recent years, I've been asking students to buy a $25 text. It's not really a text for a college level class. It's called Botany in a Day. I don't think it's great, but I think it is nice for them to have some kind of a reference. And if they don't buy it, it's not really a problem. It's just, it has information written in a different way. It's got pictures, et cetera. And it's not terribly expensive. Everything else we provide. So we provide a spiral notebook, hand lens, a very, very inexpensive macro lens, which they never use, a ruler, and a bunch of other things. And then these two little plastic animals that I used to confirm they took the photos themselves. So here's a picture I make them into little groups of 2, and then I take pictures of them with numbers, and then I give each student a numbered bag, so that I can keep track of who's got which animals. They so far, nobody has ever tried to cheat in that respect, but I will say some of them really make great use of those animals, and the pictures that they send me are hilarious. So that's been fun. I try to encourage, so I'm still trying to figure out like how to make use of and give credit to students for their, their cultural capital, their unique skills and knowledge. But I have an advantage in this class in that I literally can do whatever I want. Okay, and of course I bring in lots of food. Okay, so that's what I'm going to say about my attempts to sort of create a more inclusive and equitable classroom. And then now I want to talk, I don't have very much time left, shoot. Okay, I'll try to quickly go through talking about how I've tried to incorporate different perspectives in my teaching. So in order to do this, I've reached out to colleagues, I've read books, I've followed up on social media posts, I've Googled, and also importantly, I've attended workshops and symposia. So different scientific societies, for instance, as well as different institutions are starting more and more to host speakers who are talking about these topics. And I mentioned these other points already. Okay, so botany has a long history of colonialism. The kind of botany that I do, plant diversity, is particularly entrenched in this. And some aspects are pretty obvious. So for instance, naming plants after abusive, racist European and white men from the US. And some of you may be aware that the ornithology community is starting to take a look at this, and it's actually been quite controversial. But just one example, is John Fremont, who collected thousands of plant specimens, including 163 new types of plants and 19 new genera. And a lot of plants are named after him. The California Native Plant Society's publication was named after him. It turns out he also led the slaughter of up to 1,000 native indigenous people in the Sacramento area, mostly women and children, and other atrocities. And so the California Native Plant Society has now changed the name of their publication to Artemisia, but it's a much higher hill to climb to change the name of the plants. So this is just to show you, I'm not going to read through this, but this is just their explanation of why they changed the name. And here you can see the old journal and the new one here. Since this is being recorded, you can get a chance to look at this stuff in more detail. And I can make the PowerPoint available too. Okay, so some aspects are pretty obvious, but others are less obvious. So the language that we use is actually really, really weighted down with bigotry. So scientific, for instance, we use the term folk taxonomy versus scientific classification. And the implication is that folks taxonomy is somehow lesser than scientific classification. It's not as good. And as in the last example, we refer to the discovery of plants that were known for centuries or even millennia by indigenous people. And this also the decisions about what we teach, how we teach it, how we carry out our research, etc. All of these contain much less obvious examples of systemic racism and colonial influences. So one example is, again, the names. So why don't we use indigenous names? So this is an example that I actually use in the other class, the introductory plant biology class. So we use Latin names because the names of genera and above convey phylogenetic information, so that's useful. They're the same in science around the world, in theory at least, and many are entrenched in the literature, and the idea of changing them at this point is just more than people can cope with. But also, if you are going to change even the common names, for instance, which indigenous name are you going to use, right? And it's really an uphill battle. The whole thing about common names is like, this is what people call them. How can you change a common name? It sort of doesn't even make sense. But this is just an example, in terms of which indigenous name. This is just a small portion of a list of different names of this one plant, bearberry or kinnikinnick, These names are all from sort of the Alaska and Northwest Canada area. And as you can see, they're all different kinds of names. Even different parts of the plant may have different names. There is a current effort in California to replace the name of miner's lettuce, Claytonia perfoliata, with a Ohlone named Rura, and it's really met with mixed results. Like somebody just decided we're going to do this, and the first question is like, why Ohlone? Why that name in particular? And also, I'm not really sure why the focus is on that particular species. So, it's sort of just not as obvious a thing as it seems. Okay, so one of the other things I present to them is early on, I have them read a blog post. It's called Collecting with Lao Chow, and then Decolonizing the Collecting Trips of George Forrest. And underneath, you can see their explanation for this post. For years, the curators of museums and their visitors have been programmed to respond to and expect talks of the grand, death-defying adventures of our collectors, so much so that we appear to have closed our minds to the realities and injustices of what really happened on expeditions. So George Forrest, who was Scottish and affiliated with the Edinburgh Royal Botanic Garden of Edinburgh, was commissioned by a man named Arthur Bully to go to Yunnan, which had just recently opened, to collect seeds because Bully enjoyed introducing exotic new plants to the wealthy British landowners who could grow them on their gardens. And from 1904 to 1932, Forrest collected numbers of plants in the tens of thousands. So how did he manage to collect those tens of thousands of new plants? And the way he did it was that he didn't do it. He employed a team of local people in Yunnan, headed by a man named Lao Chow, and that's the green star above his head there. And they went out every day and collected all these plants for him. We don't know the names of any other members of the team, and you'll have to forgive my capital letters on the next one, but this is the way I always hear it on my head. They collected under Forrest's numbers even when he was not in China. Even when he was not in China. So basically, he didn't collect these plants. I'm sure he collected a few of them, but this team of indigenous people did all the collecting. We don't even know who they are. And so here you can see another quote from the blog where it says, his affection for his team was indisputable. Like, it doesn't seem like he necessarily abused them. But taking a quick look at the names of taxa described by Forrest, of the 418 records, not a single one commemorates Lao Chow. And yet he named many after Bully, his wife, children, a friend, and a useful customs clerk. So this is a pretty typical story. And what I do is I have the students read it and then just write a paragraph of reflection. And some of them, will just say, oh, that's very bad. And some of them will say, well, that's the way things were then. Now we can see it's a terrible thing. But at the time, it was pretty normal. And other people just get enraged. So it's been really informative for me to see the different responses of the students. Another thing is I try to present scientific classification as just one possible system. This sort of gets back to names and the words we use. So this is from, again, the other class that I teach, the larger class, where I try to explain, that we use this term artificial classification systems. And these classification systems, like here, I have one that I use, food plants, garden plants versus weeds, right? And they're based on easily observed characteristics. They're convenient, they're useful, they're very common in every culture and community, but they're looked down on by the scientific community because they don't reflect relationships. They're not predictive. But it's a judgmental term, right? These systems serve an important purpose in the context in which they're used, right? And the name artificial is just applied by scientists to contrast it with what they think is the appropriate system. So natural systems, what they would call sort of the right way to look at things, they're supposed to represent evolutionary relationships, but how do we know when we have it right? And also, they're useful for scientific study, but they may not be useful for other purposes. So on the left, here we have the nightshade family, and these are all edible members of the nightshade family, but you probably all know there are lots of members of the nightshade family that are not edible. So scientific classification doesn't tell us that, right? If we say, oh, these are all edible, maybe other nightshades are edible. Okay, so this is just another quick example, a couple of examples. I'm really sorry. Oh, shoot, I'm really sorry. I'm going to try to,
You're okay. You're okay, Amy. It's okay if we go a little over. Don't worry about it.
Okay, all right, thank you. So this is just, these are like, they're little stories that I try to put in when they're relevant. So for instance, this is a well-known example where when I talk about Euphorbiaceae, in the mid-1870s, this British guy from the Royal Botanic Gardens in London smuggled, at least this is a story, he smuggled 70,000 rubber seeds from Brazil to London, and seedlings were grown there and transported to Asia. But the thing with this is that in Asia, so Brazil was extremely wealthy at that time. Rubber is really, really valuable. It's even more valuable than synthetics because it has attributes that synthetic rubber doesn't have, like a higher melting temperature. So to this day, natural rubber is still really valuable. And Brazil was extremely wealthy. But when they brought but in Brazil, it can't be grown in plantations because the plants have, they'll be attacked by diseases, herbivores, etc. So they took these seedlings to Asia, planted them in plantations where they didn't have the natural diseases and herbivores. And the result of this was the Brazilian economy crashed, absolutely collapsed as a result of this. Another example that I just saw this past holiday season, this was on social media a lot, is about another member of the Euphorbiaceae, the poinsettia, and how it's listed as a discovery of this guy in the 1800s. But the indigenous people in Mexico had known of this plant, of course, for millennia, and it was sacred to them. As you can see in the bottom paragraph. And so not only is it, a lie to say that he discovered it, but also, he was a slave owner. He promoted white supremacy. He was responsible for the displacement of many indigenous people. So it's an incredible insult to name this plant after him, and it totally erases the true history of the plant. Okay. So the final two things are little videos, and I think I'll probably skip the clips because it's getting really late. But I happen to be able to connect with a member of a Cahuilla citizen, and that's one of the indigenous groups that occupied this territory where UC Riverside is. So I was looking for a way to connect with tribal communities to try to get some information or somebody to give a talk on their perspective on plant diversity. And so I managed to connect with Gerald Clark, who is a Cahuilla citizen. He's also an artist, and this is one of his works here. I don't know who the woman is. I kind of hope it's his wife, but he's an artist, and I think actually a brilliant one, but you can go to his website there. He teaches in our ethnic studies department. He's also a rancher and a father. So he's a very, wide, has a lot of wide-ranging experiences. And it was just a miracle that I connected with him. But for the past few years, he's been coming and giving a talk to my class that is really enlightening. I'll tell you what I'll do. Well, all right, I'm going to try and play this. This was just, he was asking, I have to switch screens. He was asking the students to talk about their definition of nature. And so this was on Zoom. Okay, do you see the video here?
Yes.
Okay, we'll see if this plays. He asked them on Zoom their definition of nature, and then he talks about his perspective of nature afterwards. Don't be shy. Can you hear it?
Free populations of plants and animals.
Yes.
Okay.
An unaltered natural environment, bee environment, abundance of organisms. See, you guys are a little more, I think, prepared for this. I teach a lot of just general humanities class, like abiotic and biotic factors. I'm not even sure what that is. Sounds good. Sounds good. All right. Yeah, I like what you guys are putting, and you're all right. You're all right. But it's this kind of vast concept, right? Let me tell you a couple things that I've heard. One thing I've heard is that as soon as you name something, then you recognize it's outside of yourself. Okay, I think children are like age 3 or so, they begin to understand their parents. Oh, they're separate from me, right? And so when we have this concept of nature, that kind of tells us that society, Western society, sees nature as outside of itself. Okay, and I think an indigenous approach to the concept is more like, are you ready for this? The analogy I've come up with is breathing. Now, we are all breathing. I hope you're all breathing, but none of us really think about it. We're just, it is, right? And as soon as I say breathing, all of a sudden we're like, we become conscious of it. And maybe that's more of an indigenous approach to nature, right? But when we look at that Western concept of nature, you have sayings like the forces of nature. That sounds kind of scary, right? And we think about the explorers and battling the forces of nature. And it's almost this oppositional kind of relationship with the environment, right? Or get back to nature, which is much more positive, but it's separate. We're separate from nature, right? And so again, I like to read the journals of the early explorers here in California. So this is Juan Crespi. He was a missionary that came along with the Portola expedition there in 1769. I love these guys. They were really specific, and when they talked about but you can see in his writing here, large grassy hill, pure earth, broad mesas, good soft ground covered with grass, 7 antelopes. Everywhere there were hares and rabbits coming about. So this is record keeping, and they're showing us what they're seeing and how really manicured. They never quite use the word farm, right? But they're describing these just wonderful kind of environment that they discovered here. And what they don't realize it, but what they're describing is centuries of TEK, this environmental management practice by the indigenous people in this working relationship with the plants, with the environment. Okay, here's Sir Francis Drake, and this is I'm a better speller than this. This is how he wrote it in his journal. Our necessary business ended. Our general with his company trailed up into the country to their villages, where we found herds of deer by the thousand in a company being most large and fat of body. Okay, and I will tell you that the native people themselves, as well as the animals, they are rarely, if ever, discussed in terms of being emaciated, suffering from malnutrition, or sickly. The only time those did come about was when diseases were introduced that actually preceded the explorers. So sometimes things like smallpox would actually enter a village before the actual explorers entered it. So then they would talk about that. But most of the time, the vast majority are well-fed, happy, healthy people, as well as animal environments. And then, the impact.
Okay, hold on a second. I guess I need to do this. Yeah, okay, sorry. It was taking a bit longer to get to the sort of punchline of what I wanted to say there. So let me just go back to this, and I'll tell you sort of what was oh, it's still there. And then I'll wrap things up. Sorry. Okay, so what he eventually gets around to saying, and I'm of course paraphrasing, but what he eventually gets around to saying is that the Cahuilla don't see themselves as separate from nature. They don't have a word for nature. They don't have an equivalent word. They don't see themselves as separate. So he says it's not so much living in harmony with nature, which is what white people always say. They are nature. They are no different from anything, any of the other plants or animals. And that's actually really kind of a transformative concept for me. So unfortunately, I don't think there's a way I can actually share that, that video with you. Anyway, the last thing I was going to show, I won't show you this video because you can see this one yourself, is Dr. Banu Subramaniam, who gave a talk to the New England Botanical Society, I think it was in 2020. She was born in India, educated in India, but then did a PhD in the United States. And she's now, although she studied plant evolutionary biology, she actually is now professor of women's and gender studies and chair of the department at Wellesley College, which is a private school, highly ranked private school on the East Coast. And she studies the social and cultural aspects of science. So she's sort of coming at it from both directions. This is the talk, and this is the link. She talks about the colonial impacts on her education in India, cultural norms and expectations when she got to graduate school. You know, here she was growing up in India. She didn't have the same background as all the American white students who were in her program. She talks a lot about, one of her main things is looking at colonialism as what she calls an ecological project. So the whole point of colonialism was to extract resources, which had a devastating impact on the environment as well as the people. They imposed Western agricultural methods, totally transformed the ecological landscape. She also talks about the impact of language, and she uses the area of invasion biology and the warlike language that's involved in that, and then talking about it in terms of our understanding and attitude towards human emigration. So anyway, I'll end there. I'm really sorry. I think I highly recommend checking out that video. It really had a big impact on me. But at any rate, these are some of the resources. So all of these people here, with the exception of Tariaso, these are all people trained as scientists, all people trained as scientists who are now sort of thinking a lot about these topics of decolonizing, different ways of thinking and knowing, et cetera. And so I highly recommend looking at those things. So, okay, I'm really sorry that went over. But I don't know, is there time for questions?
Yeah, if anyone has questions, you can put in the chat or unmute yourself or raise your hand, I guess.
I really apologize. I do tend to kind of get distracted and start babbling. Okay, so that's a really good question, Ashley. Hi. So, you know, none of these things ever have as much of an impact as I want, because I want all of the students to be like really enthusiastic and engaged. But I will say, so when I show that video, the one I was talking about at the end, I give the students a sort of, I put them in groups, and I give each group a sort of a set of questions, different questions for each group to think about, and then we sort of get back together and have a discussion. And some of those discussions have actually been really lively. You know, the students really think about it a lot, and a diversity of opinions. You know, most students fairly predictably feel the same way I do, but there are students who think, well, this is ridiculous. You know, you're expecting too much or whatever. So I think they still hate the paper, they still hate the collection, they still, you know, hate all those things, but I'm kind of determined to, you know, use this diversity of different types of assessments. So good to see you. Anything else? All right, well, do you want me to send you the PowerPoint so you can, so people can then get the links and stuff?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you very much then. So.
Thank you so much, Amy, for taking time and putting this together. It was really great.
I hope that served the purpose. I'm sorry, I was just getting so gabby, I couldn't stop myself, so. And you know, I also, you know, I put my email on the first slide, so if anybody wants to send me an email, or you can, you know, you can go through Guadalupe or anyone else.
Okay, will do.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much then.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for being here.